The Institute of Politics is predicated on the idea that politics matters, that public service matters, and there is no one who epitomizes that principle more than the speaker we have tonight and our guest this week as a fellow at the Institute of Politics. I've known Tom Harkin for a long time. I've known him as a fierce combatant in politics, but more importantly, I've known him as a great advocate for people. If you're a person with disabilities, then Tom Harkin has demonstrated to you that politics and public service really matters. If you're a person who was in need of health care and couldn't get it, Tom Harkin has made a difference in your life. If you're a working person who was just looking for fair treatment, you did not have a fiercer advocate in the United States Congress and the United States Senate than Tom Harkin. In his 40 years in Congress, he lived a meaningful life and demonstrated the power of what politics and public service can be. And so it's really a great honor to have him with us this week. But as always, it is not my job to introduce him, but rather that of Kyle Poe, who's a student at Booth, MBA student at Booth, and has been an ambassador working with Senator Harkin this week. So Kyle.
Thank you, David. It's my great privilege tonight to introduce Senator Tom Harkin. Senator Harkin served for first 10 years in U.S. Congress, followed by 30 years in the U.S. Senate. At the time of his retirement, he was the longest-serving senator in the United States. During his time, he had the opportunity to chair the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, a committee on which he actually had the opportunity to serve with Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Barack Obama all at the same time. So he's rubbed shoulders with not only some great people, but he is a great person himself. As David mentioned briefly, his landmark legislative achievement is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he is currently running the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Civic Engagement at Drake University. One last fun tidbit. We had the opportunity to meet with Senator Harkin for a few minutes before tonight's event, and he told us one of the most incredible true stories I think I've ever heard, in which he participated in bringing to light the Conson POW story, a story that ran in Life magazine in 1970. I think Steve might reference this later tonight. But he first gained notoriety with that event and was told at the time that he would never serve in U.S. Congress in his whole life, and we're so grateful that that was not the case. So it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Tom Harkin, and our conversation tonight will be moderated by Steve Edwards.
All right, Stephen. Right.
Senator, first of all, Kyle, thank you so much for that great introduction. And I should say, let's take a moment and give all of our fellows ambassadors a round of applause. These are students who work throughout the academic year to make our fellows' time here at the university as enriching as possible. And we're grateful to have so many students over the course of this year do that. And we're grateful to you, Senator, for making time in your schedule to come and be here at the university, be here at the Institute of Politics. And I want to talk about politics today, both in the Senate, certainly, as well as the presidential race that we're in the midst of right now. But I'll take Kyle's lead and go back, if you don't mind, to your own history. And I was going to begin by asking you about your childhood. And I do want to get to the Vietnam experiences. But let's start with your childhood. You grew up as one of 6 children in a town with a population of 139 people, give or take.
Right, give or take.
Mother dies when you were 9 years old?
10, almost.
9 or 10?
Yeah, 10 years old.
Take us back to your childhood. How did those experiences shape the person you became?
Well, okay. At the fear of saying things falling into Mark Twain's trap. Mark Twain once said when he was an older man, he said, you know, he said, I'm at the age where the things I remember most clearly never really happened. So I don't want to fall in that trap. But first of all, let me thank the Institute and David especially for letting me put this off a year. David asked me to come last year. I just couldn't do it, so he gave me a year's leave of absence to come. And so thank you very much for the invite. It's been wonderful to be here tonight and tomorrow and also Thursday. It's a great institute. And thank David also for helping give us, he and a guy that used to work for me a long time ago by the name of David Plough, giving us, I think, one of the most intelligent, rational, compassionate presidents that we've had in my lifetime. Guy from Chicago, his name is Barack Obama. So thank you for getting him in the White House, David. And it is true. There was a time on our committee we had Kennedy, Dodd, Harkin, Clinton, Obama, and Bernie Sanders. No lack of egos on that committee, I tell you. Anyway, enough of that. So I was born and raised in a little town, well, 139, 150 people, small town of Cumming, Iowa. My father only had a 6th grade education. He was a coal miner. Most people don't know that at one time Iowa was the 3rd leading coal producing state in the nation. And what happened is a lot of people came from foreign countries. Welsh, if any of you have ever heard of John L. Lewis, the famous coal mine leader, most people, you can win a bar at any beer where there are coal miner unions. You can win a beer by betting them that they don't know where John L. Lewis came from because they all think he came from West Virginia or Pennsylvania, but he came from Iowa. A lot of people don't know that. So the Welsh came, the Italians came, the Poles came, the Slavic people came over to work in the coal mines. And so that's where, then my father didn't, I mean, he was born there, but his parents came from Ireland, so he was Irish. But he worked in the coal mines, never went beyond the 6th grade. My mother was an immigrant who came from the Slavic countries because her first husband came over to mine coal, then he died in the coal mines and she married my father. Okay, got that? And we had 6 kids raised in a small 2-bedroom house of less than 1,000 square feet. My wife and I had trouble raising 2 kids in about 3,000 square feet. Anyway, that was my upbringing. We didn't know politicians or anybody like that. Just they never paid any attention to us. We were very poor, but I can remember my father. I remember from my youth. I remember one time I would have been what? I would have been about 9 years old. And my father got in a car with some other people and they went off and they came back. And I remember they all sat around and drank whiskey. My father made a lot of whiskey. He was pretty good at it too. I was a popular kid in high school. So my father made whiskey. So they all come home and they would drink whiskey. And my father made that whiskey. And so they came home and they were talking about this guy was great. He's going to be this great President Truman. They'd been up to Dexter, Iowa to listen to Truman's famous speech at the National Plowing Contest. You'll read about it in your history books. And my father was a huge supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. Because a lot of things. I mean, just the underpinnings of Social Security and the minimum wages and all the things that happened. He was just a huge supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. So I kind of grew up with that, you know. He really believed in the New Deal and what it meant.
And where did your own interest in politics and public service come from?
Well, that didn't happen until high school. I was asked by a couple of women to work on a campaign for a guy that was running for Congress. I didn't know him. But I went out knocking on doors and that kind of thing. And then nothing much happened. Then I went to college. And I must tell you that in college, John Kennedy was running for president. And we were young and idealistic. And boy, Kennedy excited us. This was really exciting stuff. So I started then thinking about getting out of my major. I was in engineering with Bob Boughton, who's here. Now, he was smarter than I was. He understood math and engineering. He could do that, but I had to get out of it and major in something else. And so I drifted into political science and economics and the Kennedy campaign, and I got involved in Young Democrats at Iowa State. My history professor ran for the Senate in 1962 when I was a senior in college, and it was all student run. We didn't win, but we had a hell of a time, and it was a great campaign. So then I went in the military for a long time, and then I came out of the military, went to law school, and that.
Right.
I can't describe it any better than that.
Well, it sets up quite beautifully chronologically, it would seem. Your experiences, you were working in the office of Congressman Neil Smith, correct?
Right, exactly.
And you take a trip to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Tell us about the tiger cages.
It's the time we got. I'll keep this as short as I can. So I was working for Congressman Smith, we were working in the day, going to law school at night, both my wife and I. I had the GI Bill too. I had gotten out of the military. I was a jet pilot in the Navy, a carrier pilot. And while I was working for him, the House had set up this special committee, select committee on U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. And he asked me to go on the committee to be a staff person. So I said, okay, fine. So I did. And their big deal was to take a trip to South Vietnam and investigate the war and all that kind of stuff. So I went with them as a staff person. And through an odd set of circumstances, I met a young man who had been in these so-called tiger cages on Con Son Island, who had been released. He had been the student body president at Saigon University. They kept his brother there, and they told him if he ever talked about it, they'd kill his brother. These tiger cages have been talked about for a long time, been an undercurrent. John Conyers is a congressman from Michigan, still there today. He and Father Drinan, Bob Drinan, who was a congressman, went over there the year before we did, ostensibly to find these tiger cages. They were told they don't exist. This is communist propaganda by the South Vietnamese. Our government denied they existed. So I went over there, not thinking anything about it, until I met a guy by the name of Don Luce and met this young man from the tiger cages, Nguyen Loy, Mr. Loy, and who confided in me. I don't know why. He didn't speak English, but he liked Don Luce, and Don said he thought he could trust me. And so he trusted with me a map on how to find these tiger cages. And he said, there are hundreds of people there. Not POWs, Kyle, I'm sorry. These are civilian political prisoners, people who had spoken out against the war. Civilians, rounded up and thrown in these cages, beaten, tortured.
South Vietnamese.
South Vietnamese.
By the South Vietnamese.
By the South Vietnamese government. As I found out later, with our knowledge and support, with our taxpayers' dollars. So he drew me a map. Long story short, armed with a map, I go out to Con Son Island. I got two congressmen to go with me. Gus Hawkins, he was an African-American congressman from Los Angeles, Watts area. Bill Anderson, a congressman from Tennessee, first skipper of the Nautilus submarine, big friend of President Kennedy's. And we went out, and armed with the map and one stroke of luck, I was able to uncover the tiger cages and bring them to light. You can look that up in Life magazine, July issue. I can't remember the date, maybe July the 10th or 12th. Huh?
1970, right?
1970.
Yeah.
So Google it, look it up, and you can see all the pictures I took of the tiger cages.
These are photos that you took. Nobody had seen them before,
No.
certainly out in any public way,
No.
never in the United States.
No.
They're a major story in Life magazine. Do you have
Major
any idea how big of a story that was going to be?
Not at the time, but it became big, and then other magazines around the world picked it up, all the Japanese magazines and Der Spiegel, and it went around. It just became a global story.
Yeah. And why did it resonate so much, do you think?
Well, I think it resonated because, first of all, we had denied the existence. These were horrible conditions. These people were tortured. Many of them died. And they had no, it was not a crime. I mean, they had committed no crimes. They were not armed conflict at all. Although we did find that there had been some POWs there. There were, I didn't see them, North Vietnamese POWs there in clear violation of the Geneva Code. We knew it. We supported them. We paid for it. And that's why it became a big story. And I'd held a press conference in Washington. You can look that up too. It's on the front page of the Washington Post. I think maybe July the 7th or 8th or 9th of 1970, a whole story about that, about these tiger cages in Vietnam. And as a result, all the prisoners got released, went back to Vietnam. They closed them down. Today it's a museum. You can go visit it. It's a museum now on Con Son Island.
You went on later in your congressional and senatorial career to oppose U.S. involvement in Nicaragua, to oppose the first Gulf War.
Yeah.
How much of that can be traced to your own experiences in this incident and other places?
Oh, I think that really opened my eyes.
Really?
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. To the fact that our own government was denying the existence of these, yet funding it with taxpayers' dollars in clear violation of human rights, the Geneva Code, and everything else, and denying it to Congress. I think what Kyle spoke to was, I wasn't told. A congressman, a number of congressmen were told by a ranking Democrat at that time that Harkin, I was just a staff person. I got fired from my job, and these congressmen were told by a very high-ranking Democrat that Harkin will never again work in the U.S. Congress because I did not give my pictures to the committee. I made them public rather than giving them to the committee, and let the story out and told the whole story.
Well, I mean, what was your thought process in moving them to Life magazine as opposed to
Which only way I can
handing them over to your member that you were working for? I mean, how did you think about that, navigate that at that age, fairly young age?
We were flying back from Vietnam on a military plane. We left the next morning after I'd found these tiger cages. And as I found out later, all hell broke loose. State Department cables, military, all this stuff, things from the White House. We stopped in Japan to refuel on a military plane, and a meeting was held by these congressmen, and I wasn't invited. I was a staff person. And they demanded my film. They wanted my pictures. Gus Hawkins, God bless Gus Hawkins. Gus Hawkins took me aside and he said, "Don't you give your pictures to these people." Now, he'd been with me at the tiger cages. Don't you? He said, "If you do, you'll never see him again." And he said, "Then they're going to go through your bags." He said, "Are they in your bags?" I said, "No, they're not in my bags. I hid them." He said, "Good, don't give them to anybody." So I didn't. So I was ostracized by this committee. And on this plane all the way back, no one would talk to me except Gus Hawkins and Bill Anderson a little bit. And so I didn't give him the pictures. And he said, "If you do, you'll never see him again." And I'm the only one that had the pictures. So when I got back, and it was 4th of July, I'll never forget it, and I wanted to find some place to get my pictures developed. Well, I'm not going to get into all that. My God, it will take all evening on that. But I got the pictures developed, and my God, they were even worse than what I thought. I didn't know what I had. I just had my camera taking pictures. A little aside, some of you who are older, remember John Mitchell? He was Attorney General. Attorney General Mitchell was going to sue me because I had used government property. Though someone told him, no, it was my camera and my film that I paid for myself. Mitchell was going to go after me.
Wow. But it was really that fear that they would be buried that led you to
They would
seek
be
another
buried.
outlet. Yeah.
And it would be just sort of my word and maybe Congressman Hawkins maybe, and he was kind of a known left-winger anyway.
Yeah.
And so I said, the world's got to see these pictures.
Yeah.
And there'll be a little blurb if you go to Life magazine and see it. They had a little section there about how this all happened. And I remember the chair of the committee saying to me that, you know, you work for this committee, you work for Congress, you have an obligation to turn those pictures over to this committee. And I said to him, I said, well, maybe I do, but I think I have a higher obligation to those 500 people rotting in those prison cells on Con Son Island. So that was my higher priority. So I felt that I had to somehow get them out in whatever avenue I could. And Life magazine decided to pick them up and print them. And then it just went all over the place.
You mentioned the idea that others said you'll never work in Congress again. Of course, you go on.
Yeah.
1974, elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, serve for 10 years, then go on and serve for 30 years in the United States Senate.
Amazing.
As I understand it, you are the only person in U.S. history to have defeated 5 sitting members of Congress.
That's right. That's right. How do you know that? That's pretty interesting.
So what's...
In my more partisan moments, I wear that as a real badge of honor.
So my question to you is, and we've been steeped in the fascinating politics of Iowa during this 2016 campaign.
Yeah.
What's the secret to being an effective elected official in your home state? What do you attribute that to?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, stay as close to your constituency as possible. Understand always, and this is just sort of politics 101, not everybody's going to agree with you, but they're not bad people. And a lot of times even people that don't agree with you have some legitimate views and legitimate needs. And I also found at an early time that constituent service was really important. So I made my office in the House, and I think later in the Senate, really strong on constituent service, helping constituents with their problems with the federal government, people, sometimes businesses, whatever, city councils, local government that needed this or needed that. So I think constituent service really covered what my opponents would say was a multitude of sins on my part, and being so progressive. But constituent service, getting out a lot and being out with people a lot. And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to vote your convictions. I mean, look, folks, I can tell you, I've seen a lot of senators go down in my time, and House members. And my God, they drive themselves nuts trying to figure, oh, am I going to vote this way? Am I going to vote that way? Am I going to vote this way? One senator comes to mind, I'm not going to name any names. There'd be a vote on the floor, and my God, they'd back in the cloakroom checking this and back and forth. They dance around the issues all the time, thinking they could please everybody. I've always believed this, and I still believe it today. And I represented a fairly conservative state, and anybody can check my liberal voting record. I believe if you're honest about it, and you're not in their face about it, but you can say why you believe the way you did and why you voted the way you did and why it's in their best interests, and if you're just honest about it, and you're kind of consistent, you don't have to be always consistent, but you're kind of consistent, I think voters will give you a lot of running room. But if you're a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, they narrow down your running room a lot. So that's, I've always believed that, and I preach it a lot.
Can you recall or identify what the single toughest vote you ever had to make was for you?
Single toughest vote. Single toughest vote? Wow. Boy, there've been a lot of them. No, I'd be probably hard pressed to think which one was hardest. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah. Well,
I know the vote against the Iraqi war was one.
Yeah.
But I didn't think that was very tough. I don't know. There've been a lot of them. I think probably some of the toughest were the sort of the social issues, abortion votes, gay rights issue votes, those kinds of things were pretty tough.
Yeah. David likes to use the line quite effectively that there's a reason why Profiles in Courage is such a slim volume, that it's in short supply in politics. And I'm curious, I mean, you've seen a lot of senators come and go over 30 years in that particular chamber. How much has it changed? How much have you seen the kind of characteristics you're talking about change for the worse or for the better during that period?
Well, I mean, I need to tell anybody here, it's changed a lot. I mean, money, but money and Citizens United, I mean, it's just made it awful to run in Congress. And you're always chasing money. You spend more time raising money than you do thinking about legislation. And so when you're chasing money all the time, well, you know, you don't want to disturb this constituency or that constituency or this pool of money or that pool of money. So you tend to become sort of bland. And that, and I think the lack of a melding of the two parties in Congress. Now, at the risk again of sounding partisan, but I believe this to be true, when I first came there, both in the House and in the Senate, we had two parties that had a good mixture of conservatives and moderates and liberals. And we worked together. You could find places to meld. I mean, now I came just when he left, but you know, people like Chuck Percy from Illinois or Jack Danforth from Missouri, David Durenberger from Minnesota, Mark Hatfield, one of my idols from one of my idols, he was a Republican, from Oregon. Remember we had Dan Evans from Washington one time, great guy. Specter, that I worked with so closely from Pennsylvania for so many years, got run out of his party. So the Republicans had a lot of conservatives, liberals, moderates. Democrats had moderates, conservatives, liberals. Beginning with Newt Gingrich's time, the Republican Party began to narrow itself to where there are no more moderates, really, or liberals. No liberals, maybe a few moderates. The Susan Collinses, the Kelly Ayottes, maybe the Susan Collins, and a few others that are there, but very few. In the Republican Party. So you don't have that melding anymore. We still have, and the Democrats have moved more too. They've become a little bit more towards the liberal end of the spectrum, but there are still conservatives in the Democratic Party and moderates. We just don't have the counterparts in the Republican Party to work with. And that has made it very, very tough, both to get things done, but it also makes campaigns more hard-edged, more personal.
But you yourself, for all the talk about working together, you've also said the first rule of politics is never defend, always attack.
That's right.
You always want to fight on your own territory, not on their territory.
Exactly right. I still believe that.
So it's not as if you were above the rough and tumble.
Oh, I can rough and tumble with the best of them. Hell yes.
But what's the difference then?
I think the difference is the tone and the temper of what that fight's about. I can never remember, and I've defeated 5 sitting members of Congress, which is that record you're talking about. And I think, with literally one exception, I maintained friendship with all of them, interestingly enough. And it was never personal. But yeah, I fought back when they would hit me on a vote. I come right back at them on their votes and why what they voted for or against was not in the best interest of my constituents. And did I do it in a tough manner? You bet I did. Anyway, I can remember instances of it. I don't get into it, but yes.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about 2016 because you wrote, you and others that are part of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, wrote an open letter to Hillary Clinton, who you've since endorsed, and to other candidates running for the Democratic nomination, where you urged them to stand up for big, bold, economic populist ideas, including, quote, breaking up the too big to fail Wall Street banks, establishing a national goal of debt-free college, and reducing big money influence in politics. That's the Sanders platform, is it not? So well, why support Hillary Clinton on this?
I think she believes those same things too. I mean, I don't think she would disagree with one thing there. Again, it's Sanders, and I know Bernie, love him well, and Jane. He is a unique personality, and he has a commanding way of getting his issues across. He was one of the best people to speak in our caucus. It was always the kind of thing in our caucus when Paul Wellstone would speak. I like to think maybe a few times when I did, maybe. Or when Bernie Sanders would speak, you'd be sitting at these tables having lunch. David's been there before. He knows what I'm talking about. Sit there and Bernie would speak, and people say, yeah, he's right. Yeah. Can't do it. Yeah. Kind of thing. But he's right. Kind of thing, right? And I think a lot of people feel that way. I think
that they like what he's saying. They don't think he's the right person for the office, or the person who can really deliver.
And I think a lot of the young people, look, when I got out of the military in '68, I was a Gene McCarthy supporter. And I later supported Hubert Humphrey when he got the number, but I was a Gene McCarthy. I see those kind of like the Sanders people today, maybe. I understand that.
But why do you think Bernie Sanders couldn't be effective or as effective in that role?
I'm not saying he couldn't be effective. He could be, and could well be. What I'm saying is you got a choice between two people. I worked with them both for a long period of time. I've known Hillary since '92, anyway. You may forget I ran against her husband.
Right.
And I've watched her through all these years, and I served with her in the Senate on the same committee. She's smart, she knows the issues, and she knows how to do things. I mean, she worked with Republicans to get things done, worked with me, worked with others, always moving the ball forward, always moving that ball forward. And I think as Secretary of State, I thought she did a wonderful job sticking up for women around the globe. And I don't mean just women, I mean girls, sticking up for young girls all over this world in places where maybe it wasn't too popular. To me, that's courageous, and taking that to the highest levels. So my decision to support Hillary is based upon that, my history with her. And I will tell you openly, I talked to Bernie before he got in the race. I told him, I said, Bernie, I'm supporting Hillary. Well, he said, I understand that. Long history, long friendship, and I just feel of those two. And as Barack Obama said, she's probably better qualified, better prepared to step into the presidency on day one than anyone in the last 100 years. No doubt about it.
And yet in this primary campaign, there seems to be, certainly with certain voting constituencies, a significant enthusiasm gap. So what does Hillary Clinton need to do, particularly to younger voters and to those who broadly have been energized by Bernie Sanders' campaign, to bring them into the fold and ensure that they're fighting for her should she win the nomination as expected in the fall?
Here's how I see it playing out. Hillary's going to get the nomination. Bernie has a couple more to go through, I think California and maybe DC. Is that the only two left, maybe, I think? And then the delegates will be chosen. Hillary will have enough to get the nomination. He'll go to the convention. But don't forget, in 2008, Hillary went to the convention with her delegates. I was there, I remember it. And at that point, through her big support behind Barack Obama, and asked her delegates to do the same in a very great speech. I think that same thing is going to happen here. I think what Bernie is going to get from the Clinton campaign and from Hillary is an agreement on portions of the platform, and an agreement that she will wholeheartedly support that and campaign on that. And so I think after this, you are going to see a Hillary Clinton that will be speaking more about the income inequality gap in America, which is real, about the distribution of income in America, the maldistribution of income in America. I think she's already turned the corner a little bit on trade, that just because you say it's free trade didn't make it so, and that we need to take a hard look, not just the benefits of trade, but the costs of trade and the trade agreements. I think she's kind of already turned the corner on that with TPP. I think you're going to see her talking more about Wall Street and what needs to be done to regulate Wall Street more. personally, I hope she comes out for a transaction tax, which I've been pushing for a long time. We'll see about that one. We'll see about that. A transaction tax, so that on every transaction on the stock exchange, you know, some of those last for a few seconds, and they do these thousands of transactions. Just a little teeny little transaction tax raises a lot of money, folks. And I
It's
think
been something that some have argued for here in Chicago as well, in the context of the mayor's race, and the leaders of the Chicago Teachers Union have argued for the same thing here as well. Yeah,
I think there should be a transaction tax.
Yeah.
I mean, if I sell you something out of my store, I got to pay tax. You pay tax. We pay sales taxes. What's wrong with the transaction tax?
Well, some
That's
say,
a sale, right? Somebody buys something, somebody sells something, put a little tax on it.
And of course,
anyway, what I'm saying, folks, is you're going to see this moving that direction, and I really believe there will not be a stronger supporter of the Democratic ticket than Bernie Sanders.
Is his rhetoric, is his vigor in pursuit of the nomination at this stage concerning to you? Is he at risk of doing some damage internally?
Look, I speak honestly. Having been somewhat in that position, but never that far, you can get to be a prisoner sort of the staff that's around you and the people that you listen to all the time. And I'm hopeful that's not, I think that may be a little bit of the case right now. Mm-hmm. But as we move into the larger arena of the national context, and not just a primary here and a primary there, I think that this vigor and stuff for the nomination will recede. His vigor for the issues, his vigor for a more progressive, liberal, democratic platform, his vigor for a more liberal government, is that going to fade? That'll never fade from Bernie Sanders. Yeah. But it'll be in a context of supporting the Democratic Party and the platform against what I think to be the most ill-equipped, ill-educated, ill-prepared, irrational person to ever run for president of the United States. And you can't trump that one, okay?
I'm going to turn the microphone over to you for your questions in a few minutes, and to my colleague, Christine Hurley, who will take over from me in orchestrating the audience portion of the Q&A. But I'd be remiss in not talking about the landmark legislative achievement, one of many achievements during your long history on Capitol Hill, and that is, of course, passing the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. I wonder if you could talk for a minute about your interest and sensibilities around the disability community, broadly speaking. My sense is they come from your own brother. And
sure.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I grew up with a brother who was deaf. And at an early age, he was taken from our home in this small town, sent halfway across the state to the Iowa School for the Deaf and Dumb. To which my brother Frank told me one time, he said, "I may be deaf, but I'm not dumb." That got me thinking.
Yeah.
And then I saw how he was discriminated against. When he was in high school, they called him in and said, "Okay, you can be one of three things. You can be a shoe cobbler, a printer's assistant, or a baker. Which one do you want, Frank?" And as Frank told me later, he said, I told him I didn't want to do any of that stuff. They said, "Okay, you're going to be a baker." So they made him a baker. So his horizons, his choices were so limited in what he could do. So he became a baker, but later on left that and actually got a really good job later on, which is another story in itself. But I saw how he'd been discriminated against. I remember going to a store with him sometime, and he could read lips pretty well. And people would say something to him, and he'd say, "I'm deaf," and then they'd turn to me and talk to me and ask me, and I said, "I don't know, ask him." It's like he wasn't there. Yeah. All of a sudden, he just was, he disappeared. He wanted to get a driver's license. And they said, deaf people don't get driver's licenses. He said, so he found out, no, there was no law against it. So he took a driver's training course, got his driver's license, and bought a car. And so he was always kind of pushing against things like that. And then I often said, if I ever got in a position where I could do something about it, by God, I was. So life goes through. I get elected to Congress. And the first thing I started working on in the House was captioning for TV programs. There had already been a move afoot to do that, and I joined forces with a guy by the name of Jennings Randolph, who was a senator from West Virginia. And we delivered the first decoding box to Jimmy Carter, President Carter in the White House, to decode that line on TV. And then we set up the National Captioning Institute in Alexandria, Virginia, and started funding it. Actually, Jennings Randolph did, I didn't. He was an appropriator. And I was just in the House. And then about the same time, I get a call from my sister. And she's very distraught. Her son, Kelly, my nephew, went into the Navy, and I'd been a Navy pilot on aircraft carriers, and he always thought this was wonderful. But rather than going to college and stuff, they were very poor. They didn't have any money. He graduated from high school, went in the Navy as an enlisted guy, got on an aircraft carrier, the USS Midway, and it was in the South Pacific, over by Vietnam. No, this is after the Vietnam War. This is 1979. And he was on the deck, working on the deck, and a pilot, like me, had run his engine up. And he wasn't supposed to, but he'd run his engine up full power, and Kelly got sucked down the jet engine intake. He had a hard hat on, but it broke his neck. And he came back, and they saved his life, and he came back, and I remember he was at the Veterans Hospital at Stanford, California. Stanford University. And I went out to visit him, and he was almost quadriplegic, but he got the use of his hands back. And then he called me one time. After he got rehabilitated, he called me one time. And he wanted to go to school, use his GI Bill to go to school at Colorado State. They lived in Colorado. That's in Fort Collins. And he called me up once. He said, Uncle Tom, he said, can you help me out? And I said, what do you need? He said, I got a class I want to take at the school here. And it's on the second floor, and they have no elevator, and I can't get to it, so they won't let me take the class. I said, it's crazy. What are you talking about? I found out that that was so. And then all of a sudden, I went out there to visit them and saw how he couldn't get around. Couldn't go to a store. Couldn't get over the curbs. His dad or his mom would have to help him. His dad had built a ramp for him to live at home. First ramp I'd ever seen in my life. And I got to thinking, my God, I'd been so focused on my brother and hearing, I forgot about mobility problems. What about people that can't get around, can't go to school? All of a sudden, I said, this is bigger than just this. And this is a true story. Shortly after that, now this is about the time I'm running for the Senate, I met a young man in Des Moines, Danny Piper, who had Down syndrome. And his folks got me. And anyway, he went to Ankeny High School, and his folks had fought hard for him to go to high school with students rather than being segregated out and going to the Woodward School for the retarded. And Danny Piper went to high school, and he was manager of the football team, and he acted in, first time I saw him, he acted in a school play. That's amazing. So I got to know Danny, a kid with Down syndrome. I thought, geez, there's something else I don't know about here, folks, in terms of intellectual disabilities. About that time, I found this movement that actually kind of started after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when it banned discrimination on the basis of sex, race, religion, creed, right? People with disabilities said, you left us out. You left us out. You can discriminate against someone with a disability and there's no consequences. Wow, so I started thinking about this. I get elected to the Senate, and I want to let people know I was not the first author of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The first author was a Republican by the name of Lowell Weicker from Connecticut. And I get to the Senate, and I get on the committee, and he's the first introducer. I'm his co-sponsor. But then he got defeated for re-election by the guy by the name of Joe Lieberman. And then it fell to me to pick it up. And then I introduced what finally became the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1988. But then I got involved in this movement, this nationwide movement, with Justin Dart and so many people, Mark Bristow here in Chicago, about a broad Civil Rights Act that covered everyone with a disability. Civil rights. It's a civil rights bill. People don't know that. It's a civil rights bill. And it had some other stuff in it too. And so that's what led me to that. I am forever grateful to Ted Kennedy. He was chair of the committee, and he got me on his committee because he promised me I could chair the disability subcommittee. So I did. And you know, usually, and here I'm a freshman senator. I'd been in the House, but I'm still a freshman senator. On his committee, Kennedy's chair, and I will always be forever grateful. Not only did he let me chair the subcommittee, he let me take charge of the bill. I introduced it, had my name on it. He let me shepherd it all the way through, and when it was on the floor of the Senate, he let me manage it. Freshman senators don't manage bills on the floor of the Senate. He let me manage it, not him. He could have taken it over, let me speak on it, of course, but he let me manage the whole thing through. And so we passed it in the Senate, went to the House, and took 6, 7 more months to pass it in the House. And then it came back, and we finally passed it, and went to conference, passed the bill, and George Bush signed into law July 26, 1990. It was a hell of a battle, but we got it done. We got it done, and we got a lot of good Republicans on it too. A lot of Republicans on it that worked hard on that bill. Strictly bipartisan. But one of the benefits of, I guess, living as long as I have, or at least being in the Senate as long as I was, you're able to see what happens. And to be able to see what this country has become in not only breaking down physical barriers to people with disabilities, but breaking down the attitudinal barriers. Now, I know there are still problems out there, but I think we're much more accepting of people with disabilities in our everyday lives, in our social encounters, certainly in education. Somewhat in the workplace, I'm doing more work on that. We still haven't gotten enough people with disabilities in the workplace, in competitive integrated employment, not at sub-minimum wage dead-end jobs, but I mean real jobs. But we're working on it. But we've come a long way in terms of how we respect and deal with people with disabilities in this country. You asked me about the hardest vote I ever cast. I won't tell you, I don't know that I can tell you that, but I will tell you the saddest day of my life in the United States Senate was the day when the Senate turned down the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Saddest day. I gave a hugely emotional speech on the floor of the Senate about that. The UN had sent some people down to meet with us in 1990 about drafting a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. And they wanted to model it after the ADA, and so they wanted to meet with my staff. And how did you do this? How do you? And Gerard Quinn, an Irishman, was kind of in charge of that. And so a lot of it was modeled after the ADA, and they promulgated it. Came down to under our system, it comes down, came down, and now Barack Obama is now president. But under our system, it has to be sent out by the president to all of his departments as to what laws do we have to change and what's the budget impact. So President Obama sends it out, does his thing. It takes about a year to get this done. And comes back, takes a year and a half, I don't know, comes back, no budget impact, we don't have to change any laws, we're the best. And so he sends it down to Congress, and it kind of got bandied around, this and that and this and that, and finally, John Kerry is chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And we finally got it through the Foreign Relations Committee. The two lead-off witnesses on that bill were me and John McCain, who had always been a strong supporter of disability rights. And then he had other people. He brought in some people from the Bush administration, Thornburg, former Attorney General Thornburg, wonderful guy, Boyden Gray, arch conservative, one of our strongest supporters. So we got it out of the committee, but we couldn't get it on the floor. We couldn't get it on the floor. But finally, the election is held, And we're on a lame duck session, and we bring it up in lame duck session, but we counted our votes. We had counters, Democratic counters and Republican counters. And we knew we had the votes. You know, it takes 2/3 of the Senate, right, to pass a treaty. We had the votes. So we bring it up. I'll never forget this. Bring it up in the afternoon after a Republican conference and after the Democratic caucus that day. And I didn't know this at the time. I found out later. So we had the vote. We had the votes counted. And we lost it by 4 votes. So we got a lot of Republicans, but we lost it by 4 votes. And
what happened?
I tell you what happened. A guy by the name of Ted Cruz had been elected to the United States Senate from Texas. He hadn't been sworn in yet, but he was at that Republican conference. And I found out later from my friends that he spoke at that conference and thanked everybody, looking forward to taking it. Oh, by the way, there's this United Nations vote you got coming up this afternoon. I can tell you right now, anybody that votes for that United Nations treaty, the Tea Party is going to primary you, going to come after you. Scared the hell out of people. People who had been one of my counters, a Republican counter, counting votes for us, voted against it. A Republican who had voted for it and left the floor came back and voted against it. And that was the end of it. I didn't know that at that day. I didn't know that until a little bit later on. Did I find that out? That that's what had happened. And we could never bring it up again. We could never get it. I tried to bring it up again. Every time I brought it up, that senator from Texas would object to my bringing it up. So it was a bad day in the United States Senate, bad day. And we still, of course, it's back at the White House. Of course, Obama signed it. But under our Constitution, the Senate has to give its advice and consent on 2/3. But it's still sitting there. Hopefully, now again, here's my partisan side coming out, but it's the only way I know how to get it done, that we'll have a huge landslide this year, and the House will go Democratic, and the Senate will go Democratic, and Hillary will be president, and we'll bring it up, and by God, this time we'll pass it, and we'll get that done.
Let me turn the floor over to my colleague Christine Hurley, who's going to lead the audience questions. And we invite those of you with questions for Senator Harkin to raise your hands. We'll get a microphone over to you. We ask that you speak directly into the microphone to make sure that we can audibly hear you as clearly as possible. So I think we have a hand up back here in this row, a few on this side. We'll start with students first, all the way in the back row here. And then we'll come to this student here as we move through. Thank you. And I'll cede the chair to you, Christine.
Hi, Senator. So a lot of...
Would you speak into the mic?
Sure.
I'm very hard of hearing.
Sure. A lot of newer, younger senators have been talking about the need for reform of kind of certain processes in the Senate.
In a form of what?
Different reforms. So
reforms.
Like Ben Sass is kind of the biggest name out there, but a couple are talking about it. Do you think the institution of the Senate needs reform? And if so, how so?
If what needs to be reformed?
Does the institution of the Senate need to be reformed?
Oh,
If
God,
so,
yes,
how?
yes. Oh, my God, does it ever need reform? The biggest, of course, and a lot of my liberal friends disagree with me on this, but I think the single biggest reform is we got to get rid of the filibuster rule. You won't find it in the Constitution. It has been used in the last century to thwart all civil rights movements and acts. Today it's being used by a few people to stop, block legislation. In 1995, I first came out in favor of filibuster reform, and I came up with a plan devised with a lot of other people. See, the dirty little secret that every senator knows, but not the general public, is this. The power of a U.S. senator comes not from what we can do, but it comes from what we can stop. And no senator wants to give up that power. That's your bargaining chip. That's your power. You can stop stuff. Withholds, filibusters, things like that. I have argued openly that individual senators should give up some of that power to give more power to the body as a whole. A lot of people say, well, you know, then the Senate will become like the House. Get your Constitution, folks, and read what it says about the Senate. We're elected every 6 years. Well, that was an amendment later on. It used to be appointed by legislatures. We advise and consent on treaties. We try impeachments. There's a host of things that senators do that the House doesn't do. And a senator can be replaced by a governor. I mean, if you die or retire. House member can't. House member must be elected. So where does the ability for one senator to stop things because of a filibuster define what a senator is? It doesn't. But that's it. Senators don't want to give up that power. And that's why it's so tough to change the filibuster rule. Now, we've tried in the past. There's a way of doing it. Now, oh, God. See, it takes too long. Back in, 70, before I went to the Senate, there was a big move to change the filibuster rule, and a compromise was reached. But in that compromise, the Southern senators wrote in something very unique. They wrote in a little clause that says the Senate continues as a body from one Senate to the next. So therefore, the rules continue. And therefore, to change the rule of the Senate takes a 2/3 vote. It takes a 2/3 vote to change a rule. That means that, and I've said this to the extreme, let's say that there were 90 members of one party at one time in the Senate. Could they pass a rule saying it takes 90 votes to pass anything in the Senate? Is that constitutional? Why is 2/3 then constitutional? There is a way at the beginning of a Congress when the majority leader, assuming he has his vice president on his side, obviously, can change the rules with a majority vote. It's called the constitutional option. Now, you'll hear people talk about the nuclear option, but the nuclear option had to do with changing it in the middle of a Congress. I'm opposed to that. If you're going to have rules, at least you had to have rules for 2 years. You know, you can't change the rules 1 week and then change them the next. That was the nuclear option. The constitutional option would change the rules, at least for that Congress, for 2 years. At least then you know what the playing field is like for 2 years. And there's a way of doing it with just a majority vote. But we haven't done it. We should have done it in the last election. We should have done it when Vice President Biden. But I'm telling you, not a majority on my side believes that. I'm a minority on that, probably.
Hello, Senator. I want to thank you for coming, for sure. One of the things that I'm thinking of is I heard Father Michael Fledger from Chicago speak, and one of the things that he told Barack Obama was to not lose himself while winning the world. And so you had talked a little bit about whether it be parties, kind of swaying votes for individual members, or how you can be trapped by your individual staff that's around you, and just basically trapped by different influences externally. How do you kind of avoid that, and how are you able to still do the things and hold true to yourself throughout your 40 years in Congress, despite all those external kind of forces?
Well, look, it's easier as a congressman or as a senator. I feel sorry sometimes for presidents. You get in that bubble, and it's tough. It really is. I mean, the days of Harry Truman walking down the streets of Washington for his morning stroll and having a cup of coffee are over. You can't do that anymore. The threats on the life of the president, especially on President Obama, have been phenomenal. It's tough. It's tough. Do I have a magic line or something? No, I don't. I mean, I guess you always got to remember that you're not going to be there forever. You try to do what you can to make life better for people, to lift people up, to make our society more fair and just. You do what you can, then you know someday you're moving on. And you're not always going to be in that kind of position. And you just got to stay kind of grounded as best you can. I'm at a loss to be any more forthright than that. I mean, you just, well, I tell you, now I don't know Michelle Obama that well. I've had a couple of dealings with her. But I have a feeling she's a lot like my wife. She's a lot like my wife. You're never a hero at home. And once you start thinking you're somebody, your wife kind of cuts you down to size. I have a feeling she kind of does that a lot. You can ask Axelrod about that. I don't know about that. What?
Thank you for speaking, Senator. What's it going to take to pass comprehensive immigration reform in this country, particularly after the gang bill failed to pass in 2012, I believe?
The question is, I understand, what's going to take for comprehensive immigration reform?
Immigration reform, yes.
Well, you know, we had comprehensive immigration reform in 2005, passed it in the Senate. President Bush supported it. Democrats supported it. Republicans supported it. We passed it in the Senate, went to the House, and they killed it. They killed it because they thought they could use it as a political tool in the next election. Well, in the next election, as you know, the Republicans lost control of the House. So we won. And we won control of the Senate. Reid then wanted to bring the bill up, just like we had passed it before. Every word, just the same that all the Republicans had voted for just 2 years before. And the Republicans filibustered it. Same exact bill that they had voted for 2 years before. And we couldn't get it through the Senate. So what's it take? Well, it's going to have to take some change in the House and in the Senate with a president that is committed to real immigration reform, not building walls. You know, my mother was an immigrant, and that's what I was telling Steve. I didn't really get into that, but I grew up with people that were immigrants. God, they worked hard, and they sent their kids to school, and their kids became engineers and senators and things like that. God, that's the American dream, you know. And I must be honest with you, both Paul Wellstone and I thought this provision that was put into our immigration bill back in the 90s was wrong, which allowed, and it was supported by President Clinton, but that's another story. But it was a provision that if you brought $500,000 with you, if you invested $500,000 here, you could get a green card for you and your family. I thought it was give us you're tired, you're poor, your master's yearning to be free, not bring us you're rich and you're privileged. And I thought that was the wrong attitude. The people, I think, that have made America what it is and continue today to make it what it is are the poor immigrants who come here. The Latinos who come from Mexico and El Salvador and Nicaragua and places like that come here. I've often said, if you enjoy a hamburger, you better thank a Hispanic, because odds are they made it in some packing house someplace in America. You know, so you know, and these are the people that are starting to build up our country again. That's the kind of immigration. Do we need a guest worker program? Yes, we need a better guest worker program. A lot of people want to come from Mexico and work here and go home. Fine. And I know some of them. They come up and work in Iowa. Some of them work in some of our nurseries in Iowa. And it's becoming tougher and tougher with Homeland Security. The paperwork and stuff used to be they would come and show them their card. They'd come up and work and go home. So we need a good guest worker program. But we need to make it easier for people to come here. I mean, you go to Guatemala and the indigenous peoples, how they've been tortured and put to death by their own government and stuff, and they go down to the embassy to try to come to America, and they say the waiting line's 10 years. What are you going to do? You're going to come up the Underground Railroad to America. Well, I didn't mean to go off on that, but I just get really emotionally distraught, intellectually distraught at these people playing these games on immigration.
Are you optimistic that 2016 could bring about the numbers needed to pass comprehensive immigration reform?
I would hope so. Well, I mean, who's going to be elected? I'm as sure as I'm sitting here that Hillary will be elected, Clinton will be elected president. Will we get the House, or will we get enough in the House to move something like that? And the Senate? Well, I don't know, without it being watered down to a meaningless piece of legislation.
You ran for president in 1992.
Thanks for mentioning it. Most people here probably forgot about that. Most people probably missed that one. I almost missed it myself.
If you had beaten Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
how would the world be different today if there had been a President Harkin?
Oh, I wouldn't go into that. Later on, I tried to get my friend Dale Bumpers to run for president. This was 1988. A number of us tried to get Dale Bumpers to run for president. Brought him out to Iowa, and we thought he could do it in 1988. And after a few forays here and there, we met with Dale Bumpers, and he said, look, I'm telling you guys, and there were senators, congressmen meeting with him. He said, look, I'm telling you guys, he said, you know, I think if I ran for president, he said, I think I could win it. I think I could win the nomination. He said, you know, if I run for president, I think I could probably win that too. He said, I think I'd probably be a pretty damn good president. He said, you know something? I'd never have another happy day in my lifetime. I think about that a lot. Quite frankly, I'm not cut out to be an executive. I'm not an executive type of person. I'm just not. You can ask my staff about that. That's why I always hired good chiefs of staff. I said, take care of it. But I am a good legislator. I know how to legislate. I know how to push ideas forward, and I know how to make compromises, I think, when they need to be made to get the ball moving. I think I've been a pretty damn good legislator. I don't know that I would have been a very good president. That's not false modesty on my part. I'm like Dale Bumpers. I would have been happy after that. I mean, heck, I can sit here and I can say whatever I want to say. I can go out and I can go shopping in the grocery store and people don't know who I am. I can take vacations with my kids and I don't have Secret Service around me. No, that's kind of nice. That's kind of nice. Now, turn the clock back, it was the days of Harry Truman and people like that. Yeah, fine, but not today. Not today. Yeah.
Hi, Senator. My question for you is, if the unthinkable does happen this fall, and the VP that is tapped...
And he who cannot be named.
Right. And if the VP that's tapped happens to be one Joni Ernst, and there's an opening in Iowa, we might be able to use your leadership again. Have you considered that?
Well, there's one problem. The governor of Iowa is a Republican. What can I do? And under the Senate, he gets to appoint a senator. So there you go. Yeah, I really feel badly that I was not able to replace myself. Well, I mean that I was not replaced with a very good member of Congress, very smart, very capable, who would have been a great senator, Bruce Braley. But it was a bad campaign, and I would give credit to Joni Ernst, the Republican who took my seat. She ran a spectacular campaign. I mean, it was pitch perfect, never made a mistake, and she just ran a very, very good campaign. I give her credit for that. But no, Republican governor appoints a Republican.
And we have time for one more question. All right, right back.
Hi, you mentioned that you served on a committee with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. What was the dynamic like between those two senators, if they knew each other well?
I didn't hear.
What
Sorry.
was the dynamic between Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton when you worked with them?
Oh, I thought the dynamic was fine. Same with Obama. I mean, it was fine. I mean, we all had the same goals. We all worked together to get certain legislation through. I thought it was, I didn't see any friction there at all at that time. I can't remember one instance of that. Honestly, if I did, I'd tell you, I just can't think of one time when there was any fractious problems in our committee. I honestly can't. Well, I will say this, though, that here's how to categorize it. In our meetings and in our Democratic meetings, usually with Kennedy, Bernie was always the pusher. Got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. Hillary was the person who would say, well, maybe we got to do it this way, and how do we get these votes, and how do we engineer this, and what about this part of it? How do we put this all together? Barack Obama, and here's what I remember about him. A lot of times these meetings, of course he was just a freshman, well, so was Bernie. Hillary was in her second term. Was that right? No. Maybe she was still in her first term. Maybe she was still in her first term, late in her first term. But then Obama would sit there and listen to this. And he'd very quietly, he wouldn't say anything, and this thing would go on for a little bit. Kennedy might ask him something, and he had a unique ability. He had a unique ability to listen to this and sort of sum up what it was that we were trying to do in a very logical way. I don't know how I can describe it. He just had a way of listening to people and then sort of at the end saying, well, I think here's what people are saying we want to do and how we got to do it. And people would say, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. That's the way I would categorize the three of them. Yeah, I don't have anything better than that.
And we have one final question from
One
David
last one.
Axelrod.
Actually, I don't have a question, I have a comment that I should have made at the beginning. But you said something at the beginning, and I think it's a good place to end. You talked about the fact that you took opponents and people, your constituents who had disagreements with you, not as enemies, but as people who had respectful disagreements.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the fact that in 1984, I was a young campaign manager here in Illinois for a guy named Paul Simon.
Oh, yeah.
And 1984 was a landslide presidential year on the Republican side. Ronald Reagan was running for re-election.
Oh.
And there were only two Democrats who defeated incumbent Republicans in 1984. And one was Paul Simon and the other one was you.
That's exactly right.
And Paul, even though Reagan was winning this state by a landslide, it was actually closer in Iowa. I think he won Iowa by about 100,000 votes.
Very close, yeah.
Here it was like 500,000. But
Boy.
Paul got 25% of the vote of people who were self-described conservatives. And they knew they didn't agree with him. But they respected the fact that he was open and honest about where he stood. They respected his character, and they voted for him. And I think the same was true in Iowa, a bit more partisan maybe. But the fact is that everybody in Iowa knew where Tom Harkin stood, and that there were principles for which you would stand every day and every night. And the same was true of Paul, and I think people respected that.
He was a great friend of mine.
I feel like
Great friend.
Paul would want me to acknowledge that, and maybe even if he didn't, I felt I should.
Well, I love Paul Simon. Can I just fill in a little?
Yeah.
Just a little filler. So, I'm in the House. And I'm having tough races. I'm in the most conservative Republican district in Iowa, and every 2 years it's just a slog. So in 1982, I figured I'm going to run for governor. I'm going to get out of here. So I went to Iowa to run for governor. Well, you know, when you're a congressman, you think everybody knows who you are. Well, hell, outside of my district, they didn't know who I was. And there was a woman running, Roxanne Conlon, who had been the Jimmy Carter's attorney, U.S. attorney in Iowa. And Women's Political Caucus, very active. So I went around Iowa, and all my liberal friends said, forget it, we're supporting Roxanne. Well, I saw the handwriting on the wall. I said, I could never beat her in a primary. So I got out of that. And she lost. She didn't win. That's when Terry Branstad got elected governor, and he's there now. And so we get into 83, and I'm back in. And you might remember, 82, 83, we were in a pretty severe recession at that time. So I get reelected in 82. I see Paul Simon. Paul comes in. This is a true story. He comes, he said, we're talking about our races. He said, he's going to run for the Senate in 84. And I said, well, yeah, we have a Senate race, but got an incumbent, not an open seat. Well, he says his is an incumbent too, really tough guy, Chuck Percy. But Paul said this to me, he said, Tom, he said, look, it's going to be like 1974. That's when we came in together. Big landslide for Democrats. He said, I'm telling you, this recession, by 1984, people will catch on to Reaganomics and how bad it is, and we're going to ride that wave in. Just like we did in 1974. Well, I said, by God, that sounds good to me, Paul. And so I decided to run for the Senate. As David said, oh my God, it was a Reagan landslide year. And the only two people that won those races were me and Paul Simon. And so I saw Paul after. I said, well, Paul, I guess we did it. He said, well, he said, and you had that kind of deep voices. Well, he said, I was half right anyway. So that's my little Paul Simon.
Like Paul Simon, I always say that the world of politics is filled with two groups of people, one much larger than the other, people who run for office because they want to be something, and then the smaller and more admirable cohort who run for office because they want to do something. And so thank you for being part of that smaller cohort.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.